I'm an associate professor of economic statistics at the University of Naples Partenove. I am pleased to coordinate this session, this afternoon session. The title of the session is Methods and Models Applied to INVALSI Data. There are four very interesting papers that deal with several issues and with different methodological approach. And the rule are the same for each session, 20 minutes for the discussion of the paper, and then 10 minutes are reserved for questions. Okay? All relators are here. Then I would suggest to start with the work. Then the first work is Young People View Democracy, a latent class analysis of ICCS 2016 in Flanders and Italy by Claes 7 of University of Leuven. The paper is presented by Professor Claes 7 and written with Kavadias Dimokritos. Okay, I will ask Professor to begin the presentation. Okay.
Okay, this will work. Good evening, everybody. My name is Claes and I want to present you a paper I wrote together with my colleague from the VUB, Kavadias. And in this talk, in this small talk of 20 minutes, I'm going to take you through the next steps. First, I'm going to give you some insight in the context of this paper. So how did we come about this concept of looking into young people's view of democracy, and why didn't we pick their views on citizenship, for example. Then I'm going to go over some theoretical frameworks we went through to make sense of the things we hypothesized and the research question we wanted to answer. And then I'm going to take you very quickly through this research question and the hypothesis to also look into the data. And the data you are probably all familiar with are the ICCS data, the International Civic and Citizenship Education Study that also has taken place here in Italy, but also in a part of Belgium, Flanders, and I'm going to present you the analysis of young people's view on democracy for Flanders and for Italy. It's not really a comparative study, it's more like a case study of the both regions, countries. And then I'm going to end with a discussion because this paper is still ongoing work, so it's not published, and we really would appreciate your input too. But that's for the last 10 minutes of my talk, I presume. So for the context, Dimo, Kavadias and myself, we both of us teach a course on civic education for master students in our universities. And we notice that when we talk about civic education and also the challenges for civic education in secondary schools with our students, then that are most of the time very tough challenges that young people are presented with. Think about climate change, think about also communities that 20 years ago were very homogeneous, that are now becoming more heterogeneous, and that put tensions on the way people live together, and especially young people face these challenges also in their schools, also in classrooms. And a part of the students we teach are also teachers-to-be in social studies. So they are the first ones very concerned about these challenges and also want to give young people more strength to deal with these challenges properly. So you see, digital age, migration, climate change are the topics we talk about in these courses. And we then try to go over also school effectiveness research using data that I'm going to use today to teach them what these data can teach them, how to approach their civic education classes, their social study classes in secondary schools. And we talk about the big importance of the curriculum at school, for example, in making young people able to talk about very complex issues in a classroom. Very delicate issues, for example, in Flanders, that could be wearing a headscarf in a public office. That's a very delicate subject to talk about in Flanders. But it's a perfect example of a contested subject that students can talk about and can learn something about by talking about it to be better citizens, better democratic citizens. So the curriculum in school is very important for this. Of course, there are other ways to go about it. You also have the curriculum outside of school. Think about the extracurricular activities, sports activities, but also community services that are linked somehow to the school. One of my PhD students also recently defended her PhD on the importance of the democratic school climate for outcomes in civic education and to make young people feel more apt to also deal with democracy in the bigger world outside of the school context. And then of course you have the extracurricular activities too that can make a big difference for people. But what we also talk about with them is that we see that all these different approaches to make young people better citizens and more apt to deal with these challenges, that we see that there are ceiling effects of civic education. That sometimes it is the case that when you have different tracks in a country, you for example have a vocational track and a general track, that with civic education efforts as a teacher you can compensate for the lack of certain civic outcomes. But sometimes we also noticed, and especially in the 2016 study, we noticed it in Flanders, that actually the way participation in school is organized at the moment in Flanders and the Netherlands makes that you have a kind of acceleration effect on civic knowledge of these participation possibilities that are offered by the school. So we see that all these different ways of dealing with citizenship education, they actually have differential effects. So we cannot really say, okay, this works and this doesn't work. It really very much relates to the context in which you teach. Another strand also picks up in the civic education literature the differences between boys and girls. So looking into the individual background characteristics of students may also show differential effects of these citizenship education efforts. So all these things taken together, we also see that in these effects in very recent news items. And for example, the Youth for Climate Actions, where we see that when we analyze the young people that really are very hardcore active in these movements are often young, mostly high-educated girls. So that's very apparent, looking into the differential effects concerning the individual characteristics, but also when you look at the more extreme right protest you have against immigrants, then often you can see like that's more a boy thing and also more associated to people from a lower socio-economic background. So these things taken all together made us ask the question, why are we always looking into differential effects of citizenship education and really try to focus on these different individual characteristics or group characteristics? Why do we not start at the beginning and look at what these young people's views on democracy are? And when we have an insight in how they look or think about democracy, then we can maybe work with these different views on democracy to actually adapt our civic education, not to individual or group characteristics or context characteristics, but more towards their views on democracy. So that was the background at the start of our paper. And of course, with these insights in mind, we looked into citizenship education literature, and we actually thought, okay, it's best, we are interested in citizenship as a feeling, and citizenship as a feeling in ICCS, and that's a definition that we found with Derek Heather, from Derek Heather. And in ICCS, citizenship or citizenship concepts are measured with these items that you might already know. For example, item I, taking part in activities promoting human rights or voting in every national election. But what was very apparent there, again, was that this gave us an insight into citizenship, but this didn't give us an insight into democracy. Because you can be very active in society, but it can be very active, that's problematic for democracy. And then you can think about the dark side of social capital that authors as Putnam also refer to. So you can be a very active young person, but actually active in groups that are very counterproductive for the democracy we want in, for example, countries as Europe. So this was a scale that we did not pick to look into their views on democracy. We also wanted to grasp somehow that democracy, what democracy was. So democracy is really a legitimate system. It has some checks and balances in there, so we wanted to grasp that. But democracy also has the non-legitimate part, what is not thought of as democracy. So we also looked into studies about political extremism and problematic politics. We really try to connect these two with each other, like the civic education literature talking about the feeling, the support and the no support for democracy, and the, looking into the definition of democracy as a legitimate system. And then we came up with our main research question, of course. Do young people's views on democracy undermine democracy as it's defined today as that legitimate structure? And based on what I told you before about the different outcomes of civic education, we also kind of, and about the literature we read about it, we also kind of expected that we would find profiles of different views regarding views on democracy, and that they would already exist in early adolescence, because we know that views on citizenship already exist when people are 14. But we also, secondly, expect that these profiles will have different participation patterns, for example, and are related to different background characteristics. A bit of what I explained in the beginning of my talk. For the data, we used the ICCS data of 2016. We first did the analysis for Belgium, and then we replicated the analysis for Italy. So we stay in the European part. As you all know, ICCS used several instruments, a student knowledge test, but also a student questionnaire, and we're actually going to use the student questionnaire today, where you can find a lot of information about participation, but also about background characteristics, and also about young people's views on democracy. Now, there is a question in the student questionnaire about if young people think something is good, neither good or bad for democracy. But what is a pity that these items do not form a scale. So you might think, not forming a scale, then we cannot use it. Well, we try to use it, but by using a different technique. We use latent class analysis, and that's a kind of person-centered approach, and that really looks at how individuals have the same patterns in answering several items, and then groups these individuals in several latent classes. And if they all answer randomly, then we will not find a model that fits and we will not find latent classes. But unfortunately we did. So in our point of view, we can really use these items, so not scale. The items we used for the analysis are the following. Is the following good, neither good or bad for democracy? And then we have an item that looks into the political leaders that give jobs to their family members. Is that something you would say as a 14-year-old you would appreciate or not? Or you have doubts about that? The second item looks into the more market, the market can influence how democracy works. Like one company or the government owns all the newspapers in a country. Is that beneficial for democracy or not? Third, people are allowed to criticize the government publicly. All adult citizens have the right to elect their political leaders. That's a very basic one, I think, for democracy. The fifth is people can protest if they think a law is unfair. And last but not least, the government influences decisions by courts of justice. And to give you a kind of hint about this, the last one, you will see very mixed results for the last one, and I was puzzled about that. But then I talked to my class about it, about these results, and they actually found this quite okay. And when I hinted to an example where a Flemish politician tried to influence a court decision, and they were all like, yeah, this is neither good or bad for democracy. And I thought, these are masters in political science. This is surprising. So, but that also gave me a hint. Maybe we should also, democracy is also something that can evolve. This, for me, is really one of the cornerstones of democracy, like the separation of lawmaking and also the courts, but for them, not so much anymore. Okay, now going into the more exciting things, the results, and I still have 5 minutes, so that's okay. These are the results for Belgium, and I'm going to take out, I think, one example, maybe a very clear one. Here you can see that we found 4 latent classes, and we tried to give latent classes a name. For the last one, we are leaning towards to call it an ademocratic class, but we're not quite sure if that's a good way to call it. So in Flanders, we see that for the question, people are able to protest if they think a law is unfair. That last class here thinks that, okay, this is still quite good for democracy. And also the other classes, the majority thinks it is a way to go. With the law-abiding, and this is very typical, I think, for the law-abiding, that they do not really see protests as the best way to deal with that. They most of the time will opt for more conventional measures to get involved in politics. Now, for the ademocratic, for example, and we will take the second as an example. One company or the government owns all the newspapers in the country. Then we see that, well, quite a lot of the young people say that this is, in the ademocratic part, that this is not so bad for democracy. And when you would take the not so bad and good together. So we see that there is a kind of a trend of young people in Belgium behaving in a certain way and answering these questions in a certain way. And now for the Italians, the Italian young people, 14-year-olds, 15-year-olds, 8th graders, better. We actually see similar patterns, and definitely here with the last one, these are similar patterns. So the government influences courts of justice. Here you can see that especially the ademocratics thing, this is quite good for democracy that a government does that. Also, political leaders give government jobs to their family members. You see that when you would, for the last class, which contains 14% of the students, you would count good and neither good and bad together, you would come at a 95 percentage. So that's quite a lot. Now we also looked into the relation with participation. And we indeed found that in both countries, with conventional participation and social participation, we have like the lowest correlation for the a-democratic. The lowest scores, excuse me, for the a-democratic. When we looked into the background characteristics, then we see no clear gender difference for the Belgian results. For the Italian results, we do. We see that boys tend to be more part of the a-democratic group and girls are more part of the mainstream group in Italy. Again, for the parental background, looking into the relationship with the classes, we see no clear differences in Belgium. In Italy, we see that the a-democratic have a lower SES. And then looking into the knowledge, we see a difference between Belgium and Italy. In Belgium, the law-abiding and the a-democratic have the lowest knowledge scores. In Italy, it are what I call the monitorial. That's maybe not a perfect term. That are the people that only interact with democracy when it comes close to them and their own preferences. And we see that they score second to lowest in lowest in Italy, and second to lowest in Italy, and the a-democratic are low in both countries. Now for the discussion. Well, we should develop the relation to the theoretical framework further, because the monitorial is maybe not a good term. A-democratic is also a term we came up with. So it's not something we can find really in the literature. So suggestions there are welcome. We think that it's a step for civic education to take into account different profiles, to foster more civic competences of young people, not focusing on their individual background characteristics or the context, but more on how they really think about democracy. And for the a-democratic part, yeah, of course, this group of a-democratic youngsters might always have been there, but of course their political significance can change in a context of democratic regression. And my colleague always wants to end with a joke. So here it is. Thank you for your attention, and if you have questions.